pleasure to introduce our main speaker tonight. As you know, this topic is very serious and one that we want to protect our families. So we're very pleased that Senator Hall, who really knows this subject, is here with us tonight. Let me tell you a little bit about him. He's a Republican member of the Texas State Senate and part of the Tea Party movement. He serves District 2, which includes Rockwall, Canton, and Greenville. He served on several committees last legislative session. Some of those are border security, agriculture, natural resources and economic development, transportation, veteran affairs and military installations, Joint Committee on Border Security. So he really knows what's happening in Texas. Senator Hall graduated from the Citadel in Charleston, South Carolina with a degree in electrical engineering and received a regular commission as a second lieutenant in the U.S. Air Force. Upon graduation, Bob began his active duty as a systems engineer, working to develop the Minuteman missile system during the Cold War at Norton Air Force Base in California, where he achieved the rank of captain. After the Air Force, he worked in the aerospace industry as a systems engineer and business development manager. In 1982, he left the corporate world and began working as a consultant to aerospace and defense corporations. Then in 1984, he formed his own company called Professional Proposal Management, Inc., which remains a family-owned business today. We are exceptionally honored to have Senator Hall speak to us tonight. Please give him a warm welcome.
Talking about the EMP.
A city in chaos. Rioting and looting have been reported as widespread power outages continue across the area and throughout the nation tonight.
Are you okay?
I don't know what to do. I'm so scared.
Honey, where are you? Are you there?
Mom!
As I mentioned, our world is changing significantly. And what those that have been paying attention to this issue of our grid security describe this as an existential threat. That is, it is something that could absolutely destroy life as we know it in America. And I don't mean to be dramatic with this, I'm just telling you the facts associated with what we're faced with. Because unlike what it was when I was growing up, and some of you, where electricity was a luxury. I mean, if you went without power for a few days, for a while, it was no big deal because all you did was use it for lights. If you happen to have air conditioning, which I didn't have growing up, you didn't miss that or a lot of other things. But today, electricity is the third most important thing to sustaining life. There's air, you'll die for a few seconds without air. Live for a few days without water. But there's a whole lot of people that will live longer without food than they will without electricity. The geopolitical environment has changed, and we are at a point of an interesting convergence of the growth in technology, which has made our life so much better and easier and different in many ways, and the deterioration of the geopolitical environment in which we have now rogue nations and groups and organizations that, because of technology, have the ability to inflict damage way beyond what it would take a huge army to do 50 years ago, 30 years ago. Can now be done by a very small group of people. And so we have all these things coming together, and with a period of no power, electricity, nothing electrical for any extended period of time, you could just begin with 10 days. A recent study was put out taking a look at where there's been disasters, and if a business is shut down for 10 days, 93% never reopen. Washington study that was done by the government said that if we were without electricity for 11 months, we would lose 90% of our population. That's 300 million people. So why am I so interested in this? Well, this is where I like to put things in perspective and tell you about an understanding I came to, because for a great deal of my life, I never quite got it, that it's God's plan and not my plan that my life's track is on. And it's a whole lot easier when we follow God's plan, but I was not smart enough to do that for many years, because He made some 90-degree turns in my life that I was not really happy with, and it took me a long time to get over it. But as I look back, every one of those laid a stone upon another stone that led to where I am today. And just real quick, it began right in high school with me. I was going to be a hot-shot college football player. That's what I was going to be, until God decided otherwise, and I ended up in the hospital with a back injury that put me in traction for 6 months. That changed that. Next, I couldn't get accepted to one of the National Military Academies because of that injury, but I did get accepted at Citadel. Took up electrical engineering, and I was determined there I was going to be a hot-shot fighter pilot. That was what I spent 4 years working my way up to be the top-ranked Air Force cadet in my class, getting a regular commission, and I was all set to go fly the F-4, which was coming online at that. That was the big airplane. The fighter was coming out just before Vietnam. Took my last physical at 20/25 vision. And they said, "You're not going to fly planes for this man's Air Force." And so they said, "But tell us where you'd like to go, and we'll see what we can do to accommodate it." And so I said, "Gee, I've never been to California. I think I'd like to go to California." So they sent me to San Bernardino, California, to Norton Air Force Base, where the Ballistic Systems Division was developing the Minuteman missile. They developed Minuteman I, and now they're in the process of upgrading to Minuteman II. And so I arrived out there on a very hot July 31st in 1964. And when I got there and showed them my papers, they looked at it and said, "What are you doing here?" I said, "Well, this is what I'm assigned." He said, "Well, we don't take second lieutenants here." I said, "Well, so, you know, that I didn't do this." And they said, "I don't know, grumble." Well, they're right. I was the very first engineer, second lieutenant to be assigned to the program. All the rest of them were senior captains and majors and colonels. And so while I was trying to find a job, because all the officers got to interview, and so I spent about 3 weeks playing more pool in the officers club than doing anything else while I was waiting to get my next interview. And they say, "You seem like a nice guy, son, but I just can't fill this spot with a second lieutenant." And so in about 3 weeks, Major had been out of town the whole time, TDY. He showed up, and I talked with him. He says, "Man, I got so much to do, I'll hire anybody. You can sit at that desk right over there." And that made me feel really good. I'd take anybody. That's what he told me. So I did that. In 3 years, I went from that of couldn't find a job to being actually the go-to person for systems engineering on the ground electronic systems. And at that time, the program was divided into 2 parts. It was the ground system, which was the launch facilities, launch control facilities, the command and control, communication, power system, security, and so on. And then a totally different office was the missile itself. And I make that distinction because God was still at work here when in 1967, a group showed up from the Pentagon and said, "We have a very serious problem with our operational sites. We have a new threat that makes our entire fleet impotent." And in those days, we were in the middle of MAD, mutually assured destruction. Greatest thing we ever did, because it kept us from ever going to war, because we had both us and the Russians had enough nuclear weapons and the capability. It didn't matter who fired first, we were going to destroy each other. Well, this changed all of that, because prior to this, they were going to have to target all of our missile sites, and they didn't have real accurate missiles, and they didn't have that many of them, but it put us in a little bit up on them, but not much. And so they said, what we've discovered is this thing called an EMP threat, electromagnetic pulse. And where we discovered that was when we had to stop testing our nuclear weapons out in Nevada, because the people in Las Vegas, you know, they were hard to put up. They just didn't like their windows being broken all the time. Every time we set one off, they'd knock stuff off the shelf and break the windows. So we started launching our nuclear weapons into outer space, setting them off. Russians were doing the same thing. But what we quickly discovered, it didn't last long, because we discovered every time we did that, because we were setting them off at about 200 nautical miles above the earth, we would knock out the power grid in the islands. Well, the Russians were doing the same thing. They were launching in Kazakhstan, that's what it's called today, and every time they knocked out the grid, what they had in electrical power there, and they knew they couldn't keep doing it. We knew we couldn't do it. We didn't know what they knew. They didn't know what we knew, but we knew we didn't want them doing it, and vice versa. So we quickly came to a nuclear arms treaty on outer space that nobody thought would ever happen, but it happened very quickly. And it did, because we just couldn't keep doing it. But out of it, they came back and said, our Minuteman missile is vulnerable to that pulse that comes off of the nuclear weapon set off above the atmosphere. They could pin us down, and that's what it was called, the pin down threat. And so they said, we have got to harden our missiles. And I said, well, they said, well, what about them? They said, oh, we're a whole lot smarter than the Russians. We're advanced. Our technology is advanced. We have integrated circuits in our computers on the missile. The Russians had vacuum tubes. They had vacuum tubes, so they weren't susceptible to it. And so, and Governor said this was an extremely, way above top secret program, because it meant that our whole force was vulnerable. It was a game changer beyond description. So it was very difficult to work it, because it was above anything else that was even going on in the program. But it got started with the missile folks, and then after several weeks, it wasn't getting anywhere. And so the General Kenneth Schultz, said, time out, guys, we got to reorganize and do things differently. And so he stopped it, reorganized, and part of his reorganization is he reached over into the ground system. Remember I said the ground system, launch facilities, command and control, in the systems integration office, and I got picked to be the project manager for hardening the Minuteman missile. Never should have happened, because I was in the ground system, had nothing to do with the missile in there, but that's what happened. Junior captain. Now here it gets even scarier. This, my 9 project officers that I had that had various parts of the missile, because we had a project officer for every part of it, first stage, second stage, third stage, guidance system, RV, interstages, etc. They were all different projects. They were all lieutenant colonels or colonels. Wow. What do you think about that? Junior captain now. Well, here it gets worse. The first thing I found as I started analyzing what was being done, I found that every one of them was on a course of approaching it to do things to make sure they didn't get blamed if it failed, rather than trying to get the job done. They had some 67 problems that they were talking about. So we had a big meeting, and it was over with. I threw out all but 14 of them. I still remember that. I said, these are our real problems. These are ghosts over here. There are maybes. There are what ifs. Not one of them was happy with that, but that's what we did. And anyway, there's a whole lot more of that story. But the point is, junior captain out of the ground system, put in charge of the missile. We got it hardened, we got it back on track, we got it done, we got all the testing done, it started deploying, and then I went on to be the project officer for the design and development of a ground-based EMP detector and an airborne EMP detector that we put in the EC-135 aircraft. And we were starting from scratch. I mean, we went around talking to professors and universities who knew it, who had studied lightning, to help us develop the criteria we needed, because we knew the pulse was a lot like a lightning pulse. I just bring that to say, for those folks that have heard that I got excited about this after reading a Newt Gingrich book, it's just not true. I knew this before Newt Gingrich ever wrote his book. And that's what the power company said last time. So anyway, that was, and the interesting thing was that when I left the Air Force, I never told anybody what I had done. I never talked, it was so classified. My family didn't know it at the time. The kids were real little, but they grew up, they never knew it. The wife never knew it. I never talked about it. And then about 7 years ago, I picked up a magazine someplace and just thumbed through it, and there was an article on our grid vulnerability. And I looked at it and I said, gee, this is kind of strange. What's this all about? Because we never thought in the 60s, I said, electricity was a luxury. Never thought about it. I mean, when you go to nuclear war, what happens to the power system was not top of the list of concerns in those days. Well, I read it, and then talked about a White House Blue Ribbon EMP commission that had put together a study, and they were referencing it. So I sent off and got a copy. I said, I'd like to read this. Let's see what it is. So it came a week or so later. I remember it came on a Friday, and I started reading it, and I got mesmerized. I mean, I was really mesmerized. I spent the whole weekend reading that whole report. When I got through, I said, gee, this is really good. These guys actually know, I think they know what they're talking about in this thing. I wonder who wrote it. Well, I went and looked at the list of authors, and there were the names of some people that I had worked with in the Air Force on Minuteman that were now part of this commission writing this document. So I said, wow, that's something else. Well, then I didn't really do that much with it until and then I ran into a fellow by the name of Frank Gaffney. Anybody here know Frank Gaffney? I ran into Frank Gaffney, but we were at a seminar on education. We were talking C-scope. We were there to talk C-scope. This was Tea Party days. We were talking C-scope, and we just he happened to mention something about EMP, and it caught my ear, and so we started talking, and he talked about what they were doing in Washington and the national level. Remember at that time, I had no clue that Texas had its own grid. I mean, no clue at all. And we talked about it some, and that kind of piqued my interest that they were doing something federally. And then again, several weeks later, I ran into someone else that was associated with them, and the subject came up again. They started talking about Texas, and boy, Texas really ought to do something because it has its own grid. And I said, really? Well, tell me more. So I started studying and looking into it. Next thing you know, I'm running for office, I get elected, and one of the first bills we started working on was to protect the electrical grid. So I tell you that, so if you don't understand that God has a plan, He has a plan. There's nobody here tonight that's here by accident. You may not know tomorrow, the next day, or a week, or a month, or a year from now why you were here tonight, but you were here for a reason. It'll happen sometime. Anyway, what I'm talking about here is this was anytime empowered flight, which Minuteman is when they talk about ballistic, you get all your guidance while it's in power, and once the power stops, it's just like the bullet leaving the end of a rifle. It's going to go until we got the MIRVs later on. But just initially, the dumb warhead goes where it's pointed to. But anytime in powered flight, if it zaps that computer, you'll never get separation, and so it's just a big rock up there is all it amounts to. Nothing would happen. In this study that they did, one of the things that was pointed out was of our 16, what we call critical infrastructure, which includes food and agriculture, government, chemical plants, transportation, nuclear reactors, etc. Our electrical power that's part of the energy section, any one of those we could lose and it would hurt. I mean, it would be bad for our economy, not really good in lots of ways. But the only one that absolutely wipes out all the rest is our electrical grid system. And I talked about the system for the United States. We are not part of the federal system. We are not under what's called NERC and FERC for regulations. We have ERCOT. It's a Texas organization, and we have the three power grids, the Eastern, the Western, and then Texas. Now somebody said, that doesn't look like the Texas I know. Well, the reason for that is we have a little bit of Texas on the northeast and the northwest side, and that actually is tied in with the eastern western grid under a special arrangement. It's disconnectable, and so it's not going to be a particular problem for us. The only other state that comes close to being what we are is Florida, and if you see over there, Florida has everything but the western part of the panhandle is all contained within Florida, but they are part of the national system. And I'll talk about some of the other states.
Is there a connect that up at the dam at Lake Texoma?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm talking about. We have parts of the panhandle out there, big parts of the panhandle that are part of the western grid.
Well, I'm talking about Lake Texoma. I thought there was a connect in Oklahoma.
Yes, there is. That's what I'm saying, there is. But we can disconnect. We have a special agreement, and it was set up so that this is not considered permanent, does not affect us and make us part of NERC. When I talk about the grid, the there's lots of parts and pieces to it. And each one has its unique characteristics. Each will require something a little bit different. But overall, you can break it up into basically 6 sections. Starting with the generation, here in Texas, we have all kinds of generation. We have natural gas, we have coal, we have nuclear, we even have some hydropower. But there are relatively few generation stations and a huge number of consumers. As you move down from 1 to 6, the numbers get bigger and bigger out there in terms of quantity of items and equipment. And because it has to be transmitted over long distances, this is a result of just the way the electrical grid system has grown. I describe it, it's a good version of Topsy, because it was never redone at any stage. It was just added to over years as it got bigger. But in order to transmit power over any long distances, because you get a huge voltage drop, you have to start at a very high voltage. So we have what we call step-up transformers. These are the high voltage transformers. They weigh several thousand tons. They're each is unique, designed and built wherever it's used. And we don't even make them here in the United States anymore. They're only made in South Korea and Germany, and they take 24 to 36 months to get. So we lose one of those, and somebody is without power for a very long time. Then we have the long transmission lines, which are huge antennas and are very susceptible to an EMP pulse affecting them. And I'll talk more about that a little bit later. And then as we get closer to where it's going to be used, we start stepping the voltage down, and it goes into substations and then eventually out to the customers, which are both business and residential. We need all of what's up there, 1 through 6, in order to have power. And this is one of the issues that we'll be talking about, is not only just the delivery of the power, but the customers. And without getting into too much detail, what I mean there is they can't generate electricity unless somebody's using it. This is not like they can go build stuff and then we use it as we need it. Today, electric power is instantaneously generated based on demand. There is very little margin in there to allow, it's just for time thing. And technology that has made life so much better makes us more vulnerable. Just one real quick example. How many of you remember we used to have, if a transformer went out somewhere, your lights would go out, and it may come back on in a few hours or the next day, or whatever, it's going to take quite a while. Have you noticed in the last couple of years that your lights will blink sometimes?
Switching.
It's because we've gone from manual switching to reroute power to computer control switching. It makes it more convenient, it makes life better, but it also makes us more vulnerable to this. So we're kind of working against ourselves when it comes to grid security with what we keep doing to make life better. So let's talk about the threats. There are really 3 of them that we can break into 2 to 3 categories. 2 are man-made, 1 is natural. We have nuclear, that happens, and I'll talk about it in a little more detail in a minute here. In addition to that, if you don't buy the fact that someone may attack us, nature is out there, and they exist in nature. They have existed forever, and they're going to continue to exist. And it's not just a scientific theory, it has actually destroyed things here on Earth. We call it a GMD, a geomagnetic disturbance, and it occurs when the lay term is a sunspot. The more technical term is a coronal mass ejection. They occur all the time, coming off the sun in all directions, all the way around the sun. They only affect us when they come off of the sun in a direction that is aimed towards our orbit, where we will be in that orbit. Other than that, they don't affect us. They happen all the time. And then we have a non-nuclear. We have weapons that are actually made. The military has them. We call them focused energy projections. They've been around for a while. You've probably seen some movies where people rob banks and rob casinos using an EMP generator that fries their computers and turns things off and so on. Actually, you can build these with parts you can get at Radio Shack. It's not difficult. It's very easy. They are not, these are the non-nuclear, they will be very local oriented. They have very short range and not very wide, but they are effective where they're used. We have missiles with them mounted on them. The Chinese have them, and there are people who believe the Chinese wanted us to believe they had them. If you remember a few years back, there was a cruise ship off the coast of California that wasn't far from one of our military naval ships, and that cruise ship was the same night that people reported seeing a plume from, described different ways, but it was going away from the coast as opposed towards it, but nothing was much written about it. They had to go tow that cruise ship in. It lost all electrical, everything on it was lost that night. But didn't hear much about that, did you? Okay. Okay, what happens, the way this works, I think I got it, is when you detonate, they call it a HEMP, or high altitude nuclear electromagnetic pulse is a more common term for this particular one. It's line of sight. The size of the weapon is really not important. A gamma ray is, but you get that with any of the weapons. You can have an enhanced weapon that is not as much on blast but higher on gamma ray. That's what they've done for the weapons that they actually developed to use as an EMP weapon. But you can take any old nuclear weapon. One of those that went lost from the Soviet Union back when the Soviet Union collapsed would be worked just fine. Get it up above the atmosphere. The higher it is, the longer its range, its line of sight. The circles on the right over here, you can just, it gives you an idea. If it was at 30 kilometers, be a fairly small area within the central part of the United States. But detonating roughly anywhere over the central part, you know, Nebraska, Kansas, it doesn't have to be accurate. Doesn't really matter how high it is. But you get up to about 300 miles, and it is coast to coast, border to border, that it will be effective. And how it works, what really happens is when that weapon goes off in outer space, you'll never feel a thing. You won't see anything unless you happen to be looking right where it is in just less than a millisecond of a bright flash, very bright flash. But there are no kinetics. There's no force you feel off of it. It has no impact on human beings, animals, plants, trees, or anything else. But the gamma rays coming off, when they impinge with the particles in the atmosphere, they knock the negatively charged electrons off of the particles, and those particles then interact with the Earth's magnetic field, and just like a magnetic induction motor, they generate, just like any motor, generate current as a result of the induced current, and they will produce, will induce in excess of 200 volts per meter, which will fry most anything. The Congress has been working on this since 2000. They've had several bills. Trent Frank's name will come up. You'll see him in a minute in a little short video that has tried to get this through. But the power of the power companies, I tell you, that's one of the things I learned down there in Austin this time. That lobby is a whole lot more powerful than I ever really thought it was in how they get people's attention, because I can tell you a number of legislators that I went and talked to about this. You know, I'm just an engineer, you know, just looks at common sense, talk to them, and they look at me and say, but you know, the industry doesn't support this. And I say, but, and I'd go through it and they'd look at me and say, but the industry doesn't support this. I said, of course they don't. They don't want to do it. But anyway, that's how it didn't pass. I'll get off of that one now. We know that it's real. We know that Russia and China have the capability. And these are the countries they're run by. Let me talk a little bit about what we know about each one of these. This is kind of out of the speculation. These are all facts in here that we know that they have the ability for a pin-down attack on us. We learned this when the USSR collapsed. We had a number of very high-ranking Russian officials who defected the United States And they brought with them a ton of information about the USSR and what they intended to do. They've even outright told us in a conference we had back in 1999, and their doctrine clearly speaks of the use of an EMP attack. North Korea, this is one that's, the Russians don't bother me. I really, I don't think the Russians have that much to gain or see it. They've got enough of their own problems over there to be the threat that we once thought they were. But North Korea, they scare me. When you run by someone who really seems to have a few screws loose, but they have openly threatened an EMP attack. We have watched them develop their missile system. They just launched another one the other day. We read the newspaper about, that it was a failed launch. It didn't work. Well, it wasn't a trajectory if you were looking at it as an intercontinental ballistic missile to deliver a ground-based weapon. But for a trajectory for a EMP, it was exactly perfect. They've repeatedly threatened us. And in April of 2013, they put a weapons-grade satellite into a south polar orbit over the United States. And it happened on exactly the same day as a well-coordinated ground attack on a major substation in San Jose, California, in which they blew up, shot up the station, and came within one circuit of taking out power in about a fifth of California. Same day, the North Koreans put this, they've never solved the attack in California, and they have never solved a similar attack that occurred right here in Texas at Pedernales. Not as big and was not effective, but it was still a military style attack. But they put that satellite up, and then in January of this year, they put their second one up. They now have 2 weapons-grade satellites on a south polar orbit. And what's significant about South Polar is all of our weapon systems for the Russians are all on the dew line. We never expected an attack from Central or South America. We just figured Brazil and Venezuela would not attack us. So we have no south-looking defenses. Besides, with a satellite, it's only a few seconds between the time they would decide to let it go and it would be effective. An interesting thing that I just recently learned was that we've been monitoring both of these satellites, and we have yet to find any where they have actually sent any data back from either one of these satellites. So either they have 2 up there that totally failed, or they are doing what a weapons satellite does, and they're sitting there waiting for their code. But that's from North Korea. Iran. It was in the newspaper here not too long ago that we caught them manufacturing the items that are needed in order to harden your own electrical grid. They were on the prohibited list, but they ignored that and they started manufacturing themselves. We recently acquired their war plans, or enough of them to figure out what they were doing. And in those war plans, they reference an EMP attack on the United States in 22 different war scenarios. And anybody that doubts that they have the capability to build a weapon, it really is irrelevant. There are enough other countries that have them that they would not have a problem getting one if they really needed it. Pakistan is probably a good candidate. We know China has, but similar with Russia. We also know that China has hardened their electrical grid on the mainland off of nationalist China. Think of it. Taiwan. So they are, and they've talked about it in their military doctrine, have had the capability for years. Trent Franks has led the effort. Great, really, really good congressman. I've had the pleasure of meeting with him and working with him on several occasions now, but he is relentless in the pursuit of this in Washington. This year he got a bill called the SIPA, a critical infrastructure protection bill out of the House. It's in the Senate. It was being held up by Rand Paul. He has taken his tag off of it now, and so it may have a chance of getting to the floor in the Senate. It'll be interesting to see if it passes there and if Obama signs it. We talk about one of the most likely methods of delivery. When I talk about how simple this is, and this is one of the things that's hard for people to get their head around, because we've always thought about anybody that's going to come take America is going to take a huge army. And we're talking about millions of men, lots of ships, lots of planes, and lots of fighting. That's what ever since we took on Great Britain, that's always what we've looked at, is a huge number of people coming ashore. And because we have our Second Amendment, they would never do it because we would be the best armed people in the world to stop them. Well, this is a game changer, folks. They don't have to set foot here. And it is so simple and easy. This is, some call it a scud and a tub. All it takes is one medium range missile, an old SA-2 type missile, a rusty old cargo ship, and about 6 people sitting off the coast of Galveston, Charleston, South Carolina, or San Diego. And just one, is all it would take. And if you don't think it's real, in 2013, we intercepted a North Korean cargo ship carrying about 10,000 pounds of sugar. And underneath that sugar were 2 SA-2 missiles with all of what was needed to launch them. No nuclear weapon, but everything else was right there. And there are other ways. It could be done with a weather balloon, not as effective, a range from it, but cheap and easy. It could be done with an aircraft, a high-performance aircraft and a zoom climb. Again, not as high, not as effective, but it would be enough to seriously cripple the United States. And our military. Our military has been protecting our equipment. I was talking to somebody in here before it started that had worked on some, I believe it was Navy equipment that was hardened. Most of our communications gear, command and control, whatever is needed for command and control and communications, has been hardened since the 70s. And a real tail item was last year, the military started spending what will probably be about $1 billion to refurbish Cheyenne Mountain to move the command structure back in. This is where our command structure was during the Cold War, because we thought that under nuclear attack they would survive. Well, as the Russians started getting more accurate and bigger weapons, there came the realization that that wasn't going to survive, so they stopped the expense and moved out of Cheyenne Mountain. They've been out about 20 years. Well, they're now moving back in specifically because of the EMP threat. That has been published. The natural threat, there's a good shot of a coronal mass ejection leaving the sun. It has happened in the past, in the near past, and let's see, and NASA estimates that our chances of one happening in a 10-year period is about 12%. That's high, very high. 5 minutes? Okay, let me real quick here. The first one, that first natural event was in 1859, called the Carrington event, for the astronomer that observed what happened there. You say, well, we didn't have electricity then. Yeah, we did. We had telegraph. It fried the telegraph system from coast to coast, and in Europe, burned operators, set railroad ties on fire because the rails got so hot, and warped them and turned them into pretzels in some places. In 1989, in Quebec, in the northeastern part of the United States, we lost power up there. It cost them in excess of $20 billion to repair it as a result of a natural event. We've been fortunate to get some help from a number of people, one of which is the Blaze. They put this short video together for us here.
An EMP is a massive electromagnetic pulse. It can be released from a nuclear device detonated at a high altitude, destroying electrical grids for hundreds of miles. The aftermath of such an attack could be devastating. Distribution of food and medicine would be nearly impossible. There would be a shortage of clean water, and first responders would be left with no means of communication. Now, this may sound like something out of an apocalyptic thriller, but this is not fiction. This is a critical national security issue that leaders from both parties take seriously, because they know that rogue nations and terrorist groups dream of a world without the United States.
After 9/11, Congress ordered a series of studies on weapons of mass destruction. In 2004, the EMP Commission delivered a report on the threat of an electromagnetic pulse attack on the United States.
The EMP Commission published 5 reports, 3 were classified and 2 were unclassified. The 2 unclassified were in 2004 and 2008. They laid out a scenario where a very entry-level weapon in the 20 kiloton range was lobbed at not a very high altitude over Cincinnati, Ohio.
Michael Del Rosso is an engineer and Pentagon consultant. He has worked with the EMP Commission, and he has participated in confidential congressional briefings on nuclear threats to America.
And the reason they chose that target is because that weapon with the radius of line of sight at the altitude, which is a nominal altitude, would have covered 74.5% of all the electric generating capacity in the United States and 83% of the substations in the United States, the majority of the population.
Bill Graham, who was the chair, the one statement he made that I think needs to be remembered is EMP is one of a small number of effects that has existential consequences that threaten the existence of the United States.
George Baker is Professor Emeritus of Applied Science at James Madison University. He sits on the Board of Advisors for the Congressional Task Force on National and Homeland Security.
The effects could be so widespread that in effect you'd have breakdown of governance. In Bill Graham's testimony, he thought that upwards of 50% of the population would die within the first year.
For the Record has learned that in 1995, a Russian think tank presented a report to the Russian army recommending the military align with rogue nations, sharing both weapons of mass destruction and missile technology.
There was testimony in 2004 by Soviet flag officers that they rather sheepishly said that technology for super EMP weapons had actually leaked out to North Korea and other rogue nations.
We think enough word of it is leaked out, it's not a very technically complex idea, that it could well be the case that the North Koreans could pull off something like that.
There's no one that will deny with any credibility that the reason why North Korea and Iran are self-professed emerging nuclear threats to the United States of America is because Russia and China want them to be and have enabled them to be. This is not idle thought. This is what nation states like Iran and North Korea have spent billions of dollars developing this capability. They're doing it for a reason, and they say the reason is the fact that they see the United States as their primary adversary.
On July 9th, 1962, the United States conducted a high-altitude nuclear test over the Pacific Ocean. It was called the Starfish Prime Test, and the electrical pulse from the blast was felt 900 miles away in the Hawaiian Islands. The data collected from that event showed the U.S. military the potential damage an EMP can cause, information they have had for more than 50 years.
After the Starfish Prime test, the U.S. government immediately took steps to protect military assets.
The Department of Defense, as they built out the Minuteman system, the ground system and the missiles, included EMP protection in the Minuteman system. It's been 50 years ago.
So we've hardened that capability tremendously, again, at the cost of hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. But our civilian grid, upon which 99% of the military's electricity in CONUS is dependent upon, is essentially unprotected.
I think that's largely right. I think the only civilian systems that were hardened were the President's airplane and maybe some of his command and control, assuming you want to consider that civilian, but no one was thinking of protecting the civilian infrastructure.
And that is the great conundrum here for me, is that one of two things is true. Either the military has this wrong, and this is no problem, and therefore we should stop spending all the money to harden against it. Or if it is a problem, then we should harden the grid upon which the military depends for 99% of its electricity needs in this continent.
Nobody's in charge of the electric grid. Do you think Department of Energy? No. Department of Energy basically works on nuclear waste and funds nuclear laboratories. There's a small office that deals with electric grids, but nobody that has any real power. This is something that is not being dealt with. It is, improvements in it are fought by industry, and it's extremely frustrating because it's very dangerous to let this grid sit there the way it is while the Russians and Chinese have fully and completely protected theirs. Yes.
They're ready for that.
Yes.
What does that flag?
Well, it tells you that on this issue, the Russians and Chinese are more responsible than we are.
In 2004, the Congressional EMP Commission estimated that it would take a one-time investment of $2 billion to harden the entire U.S. electrical grid against an EMP. Today, that estimate has actually been reduced to $500 million. That's less than 1% of what the Government Accountability Office reported was wasted in 2012.
Okay, she didn't have anything else to say except goodbye there. Let me try to, we're out of time, so let me see if I can get, the big issue I was going to talk about here is with first responders, and the fact that when you've got to get your head around understanding when you have no electricity, nothing electrical works. And so there's no pumping of water, pumping of gas, pumping of sewer. There are no trucks running, there are no cars running, there are no lights, there are no cell phones, TVs, etc. And it's going to be a real challenge for our first responders to be able to do their job and take care of their families at the same time. All of that. Okay. Let me summarize it here where we are, because I couldn't put that slide up when the session, in the middle of the last session, because I didn't see any light at the end of the tunnel. We had so much opposition. I now see the possibility, if we keep doing what we've gotten started in this past session, because our Lieutenant Governor made this an interim study. That's a huge item for those who don't understand. The interim study from the Lieutenant Governor. So it was an interim study. I have met with our governor. He has told me himself that it's a priority item for his office. Now, don't ask me to tell you what priority means in his office, but that's what he said. And I hope it's somewhere just ahead of pre-K, but that's yet to be something. We've got a number of organizations, people that you saw in there, Trent Franks, Woolsey, we've had those people down in Austin. They were at our summit, working with them, Frank Gaffney's organization, George Baker, Alan West, and the Blaze. We're getting help from other people in this thing. We managed to even get a plank in the Republican Platform Committee. I went down and testified. I think I was the only elected official that showed up down there for the Texas State Convention, and we got this in the platform along with the item for election reform in there. And we know what to do. This is not a matter of, oh, gee, do we have to go study this? Do we have to do engineering analysis? No. There are companies out there that make these products today that are being installed in other countries. So we know what needs to be done. We just need to do it. But here's what's standing in our way. And this is where I'm really not very politically correct, but this is just the way it is. We've got 3 organizations here in Texas that all involve around our electrical power system. You got ERCOT, Public Utility Commission, and the power companies. And the power companies are at the top of that triangle is not by accident. They're up there because they're actually the ones that are in charge. There's nothing that comes out of the PUC ERCOT that is not approved by the power companies, that they're allowed for accepting of the rules and regulation. And I call it the unholy alliance, the electrical cabal. They don't like that at all, but that's just the way it is. Now, real quick, because I know you want to wrap it up, because there's a real positive side to this, and I don't want to leave with all this downer. I want you to think about this real positive side out of this. We do a whole lot here in Texas to try to attract businesses to come here. We spend money out of the enterprise fund, which we shouldn't be doing. We give tax abatements, which we talked about with the judge, and he tells me you stop doing that, or you're ready to stop doing that here in Collin County, and that is great. But we do lots of things to try to attract businesses here. Good grief, we give Hollywood movie producers $100 million a year to come here and make movies in Texas. I said, we ought to charge them extra. Tell them, this is Texas. You're going to make a movie here, we're going to charge you for it. But anyway, think about this. We do lots to attract businesses. If we were to be in the process of hardening our grid, instead of doing what Rick Perry said, come on down, Texas is open for business, we just hang up the shingle that says, when the lights go out, they'll be back on in Texas first. I like when, if the lights go out, they'll only blink in Texas. I think businesses would fall all over themselves to move to Texas. None would ever think about moving away, but more importantly, the military. Texas benefits to the tune of $154 billion a year from our military. They use the same electricity that you use. They don't have their own power system. They use our civilian electricity. If we were to harden our grid, I don't think they would ever think about closing a Texas base or shrinking it. Matter of fact, I think they would add to it. So, to wrap up, we got that in there. What we need. This is your part. This is where it comes to you. You leave here tonight and you will remain part of the problem, or you can go out that door and become part of the solution. And part of the solution is to make sure that all of our legislators and ERCOT and the PUC and the power companies know that we know about this serious issue and we want something done about it. And the only way that's going to happen is if you will communicate with them. And you passed out a sheet that gave you what you need and how to contact all of those organizations. I'll say your legislators in this area, they get it. I'm not concerned about them. I go to areas where I tell you, you got to call your legislator because they don't quite get it. I think you guys from here get it. But the governor would like to hear from you, the lieutenant governor, the PUC, ERCOT. It helps them make a decision knowing that they're doing something that everybody wants done. And so writing a letter, sending emails, writing a letter and sending emails and making a phone call will help them to understand that you, now if you don't care, then go home and don't do it. But if you do, if you care about your kids, your grandkids, and if we're going to leave an America for them to grow up in, then take a little time and become what our country is all about. It's we the people. We are the government. It's not the people in Austin. We are, but only when we let our voices be heard, and this is one that needs to be heard on. If you're concerned about this, if you aren't, don't watch TV. With that, maybe a question? That's fine. Yes, sir.
If we were to have an EMP event, would it not take out the wiring in your house and everything connected to it? So the other question is, when the electric companies want to harden the network, are you also talking about the local distribution? I mean, down to the transformer on the pole behind my house. What are we talking about in terms of what's needed to harden it?
All of it, and I have talked with people that have solutions for the residents. Also, it will have. We will never get to one occurs and all just the lights blink and in a few minutes everything's okay. That will not happen. What we're trying to do right now is to move the timeline back. Where we are today is if an event happened now, it's at infinity. We will never ever turn the electricity back on again here in our lifetime. You know, it'll be a whole, because we'll be back to the 1800s, and none of us know how to, many of us don't know how to plant tomatoes and potatoes. and be self-sufficient for very long. Not many in here have more than 3 days worth of food, and they're in another 3 days in the grocery store out there. Somebody said, when one of the meetings said, you know who's really going to come out of this okay? The Amish.
Yeah.
Because they don't lose infection. Then somebody on the other side of the room said, yeah, but not for long because they don't have guns. So, so anyway, but no, there are things that need to be done, and in both the residential and industry, we know there are some, and what we're looking at is to pull that timeline back so that we can get a critical part of the infrastructure back up and running in the shortest possible time. And I don't know what that time is, right? That's what we're working on, is whether it's 6 months, 3 months, a month, I don't know, but the idea is that would be the initial, and then we would work on as they go out and make equipment upgrades over time, or we continue to make installations, that we draw that timeline back closer to make the gap as small as possible for as many people as possible. Yes, sir?
Even if we harden Texas, can we survive as a society? Because all of my money's in New York or North Carolina or somewhere else. How do I operate even if I've got left?
There is an awful lot to be worked out there. I do know one thing, it will at least give you the opportunity to figure out what you need to do to survive.
I agree, you gotta start somewhere.
Yeah, and this is the whole thing, my argument with the power company when they say, well, so we have electricity, nobody out there is going to be able to use it. I said, don't you worry about that. You worry about your business, and you're obligated to provide the power. It doesn't matter whether my toaster works or not. You still have an obligation to put power to my house. Back here was...
Bob, with all those colonels working for you, did you ever get promoted?
No. No, I decided that since I couldn't fly, I never really got over not being able to fly, and that was in the 60s, that was a flying man's Air Force. I mean, if you didn't believe that, up the Pentagon above the chief's door said the mission of the Air Force is to fly and fight. And so not flying, I didn't see that was a career for me.
Yes, sir.
Yes?
Estimated cost for like critical infrastructure, like a large transformer.
We're working on that right now.
Yes, got a guess?
Well, they said initially $2 billion for the United States. We're about 11% of that. So if you just take that number, everybody I've talked to said what we're talking about is just a few dollars per meter. This is not, and I've said, it will really, I think, in the end, the power companies will spend less money on this than they wasted on smart meters.
Yeah. So how do we get rid of
We have a lot of underground facilities of the government throughout Texas. Why don't we buy some of those German-made startups or build them here and use our rainy day fund and have them protected and waiting underground? Why isn't there a bill on that?
For the same reason there's no bill there are bills out there that are looking at what they call a critical infrastructure stockpile. And there are some of the parts, some things that are going into that now. There was a bill that passed, it didn't get funded. There are little parts and pieces of this that are out there that could happen. But there's a lot more that has to be done. I mean, there has to be some, okay, if we had the part, how do we get it to where it needs to go? And how do we operate when we have an environment that the worker has a family at home that's now out of food, now out of water, and riots are four blocks away? Do they leave their family at home to go work? We got the same problem with first responders. There's a lot of that to be worked out in there. So, yes, sir.
Could you expand on why the electrical power companies are so adamantly against this? Is it funding? Is it they don't understand it? Is it?
I think it's a combination that they don't want to accept the fact that it could possibly happen. I think that there's a great deal of it is that we have these power companies are run by executives that are more concerned about their paycheck and bonuses than they are about this might happen. And I think the other side of it is they haven't heard enough from people out there that would like to see it happen. To me, it's like insurance. I mean, you don't have a fire extinguisher in your house because you want to use it, but you sure feel better having it there. Yes, sir.
Can we as a homeowner protect ourselves or have our own energy such as a generator, solar, or anything like that?
Well, the easy answer is yes, you can. It takes a lot to do it. It has to be protected. Just having a generator won't do it because the pulse will fry the control board that starts it. If you have a control board that's protected in a Faraday shield, shielded item, and a garbage can will do that, done the right way. I mean, there's a lot of big answers to that, but yes, you can do some things. And there will be, we're not far from industry coming out with products to use. I mean, right now, Israel is hardening their grid. They're doing all of what's needed out there. Lieutenant Governor Patrick got a briefing from Israel when he was over there. We do one more here. I mean, and I'll stay if you got a question. People want to go home.
Is there a resource to find out specific mechanical things about how to harden?
You can go on the internet. There's a lot out there, and you have to just, right now, you're going to have to use your judgment on what's credible and what isn't. It's like anything else on the internet, but no, there are companies out there that are putting out products. I get emails from them on a regular basis. Some of them are questionable in my mind, but no. Thank you all very much. I appreciate it.